So as part of a client onboarding process, we've all heard of attitude to risk and capacity for loss, but financial vulnerability has become the hot topic for the regulator, advisors and banks alike. Joining me today is Tim Farmer of Comentis. Tim was a mental health nurse and has built a solution to work out somebody's ability to assess capacity for decision making. The system collects information through a simple Q&A process, but the output scoring approach is impressive. Tim, welcome, and thanks for joining me. I'm really looking forward to this conversation. But before we sort of kick off digging into what Comentis is, tell us a little bit about your background, where you've come from, and what led you to create Comentis.
Thanks, Roland. So I'm a mental health nurse by trade. I've got over 25 years experience of working with adults with reduced cognition and capacity. And I work alongside Baroness Finlay as part of the National Mental Capacity Forum. I'm a subject matter expert for the PFS on their Vulnerability Task Force. I'm a multi-award winning author and expert witness, and I specialise in the assessment of mental capacity and financial vulnerability. And about 2 years ago, I put my mind to the problem of how we can assess financial vulnerability and mental capacity over a digital platform. Because I think what we're finding increasingly these days is we're starting to find a separation between the clients that we see and the advisors and ourselves, because we're becoming increasingly online. And 20 years ago everything was done face to face, whereas now increasingly it's done online, it's done through email. And so we're starting to see this disparity, and I put my mind to how do we use the techniques and the case law and the tricks that we do on a face-to-face and use it in this kind of separated environment that we find ourselves in.
That's fascinating, and you're absolutely right. I mean, COVID has driven massive change, but sometimes it's perhaps, not being face-to-face, it's difficult to get those nuances, isn't it, that you would pick up if you're in the company of somebody, and I think that's really interesting. But I mean, again, from the regulator's perspective, from a financial advisor's perspective, I mean, what does financial vulnerability mean? What are you looking for? What are you trying to eke out when you start this process of assessment?
So the FCA have been very clear around what they see as financial vulnerability, and they've identified 4 drivers. So those 4 drivers are life events, their health events, their resilience, and their capability. And from a clinical point of view, what we're looking for is we're really looking for 2 things. We're looking for how an individual's capability and resilience affect their decision making and their responses to changes in their economic and social environments. But we're also looking for something called the causative nexus. Now, a causative nexus is that direct link between the driver of vulnerability, the vulnerability itself, and how that affects the individual. Because we know that if you put 2 people in the same situation, they're likely to respond differently. So from a clinical point of view, what we're looking for is that kind of pathway and that understanding of the psychology and behind their decision making.
So as an advisor, why is it important that I even care about this sort of thing? Why should I be concerned? And that's not being sort of trite or anything like that. What I'm trying to do is obviously eke out the value proposition, the thing which is driving this sort of behavior. So why is it important for an advisor to identify somebody's vulnerability?
So I think there are a couple of things. So first of all, it's, you have that regulatory driver. We know the FCA are looking at this closely. It's absolutely kind of top of their agenda. And we also know that they're starting to fine companies and individuals that aren't supporting and identifying financially vulnerable customers. Okay. So that's your first point. That's one of the reasons why it's important to identify. I think from a personal point of view and a moral point of view, I think it's the right thing to do. I think the majority, I'd hope all, but certainly the majority of advisors have their client's best interest at heart, and they want their client to have the right outcome. And surely part of that is being able to identify and support the vulnerable customers that they have kind of under their wing. And I suppose the third reason is that, this is this is more than a tick box exercise. It's about identifying how to support the client. And if you do that right, you're going to retain your clients, and you're going to engage with them more, and you're going to really kind of shore up and secure kind of your base of clients that you're working with. So I think there are really those three things there.
So why now? Why the interest of the FCA in this particular subject? What's triggered the concern? I mean, obviously we've got the pandemic. That's probably a big motivator for everything, to look at everything. But is there anything else? Why else? Why the interest?
So, Roland, I think you're right that COVID is certainly something that's up the ante on it. But this has been something that's been under the FCA radar for quite a while. So I first approached them in 2014 to raise the issue, and in 2015 they produced their first white paper on it. I'm not saying that's because I approached them, but it was clearly, even back in 2014, it was on their radar. Yeah. And I think one of the reasons they're so hot on it is because it affects so many people. So the FCA have identified that 1 in 2 adults are deemed to be financially vulnerable, and it's regardless of demographics, regardless of age, regardless of wealth status, regardless of class. It's just a massive issue that's out there. We know that over 2 million people in the UK lack capacity at any one time, and you're right to mention COVID, because this is just exacerbated things. I saw some of the ONS stats and research relating back to June of last year. And even within that short period of time, they identified that pre-pandemic, is that 1 in 18 adults had mental health problems that were impacting on their ability and their financial capability. Within a few months, so by June of last year, that had dropped to 1 in 5 adults. And so, why are they putting so much focus on it, and why now? Partly because of COVID, partly because it's a long-running thing, but definitely because it affects so many people.
And that's really important. But I mean, financial advisors are financial advisors. They're not medical practitioners like you. They've not had that wealth of experience that you've been exposed to over your career. So can financial advisors be trained to spot somebody's vulnerable? I mean, how does that work? And also, more importantly, should they have that responsibility?
So financial vulnerability is a specialism, like middle capacity is a specialism. And I think one of the dangers in saying, let's just try and train everybody up, is that it becomes dependent on the individual's knowledge and experience and understanding. And what this does is this leads to huge disparities in outcomes, even within firms. So, you end up with the case where somebody sat at one desk comes to a very different conclusion to their colleague that sat right next to them. Yeah. And because it's so specialist, it requires an understanding and an insight into things such as social economics, mental capacity, psychology. And when you think about the burden, if you like, the training burden and the exams that advisors have to take already, to expect them to then become experts in something like financial vulnerability, it's impractical, and I think it's infeasible.
Well, I think that's the point, isn't it?
Yeah. And so I think the responsibility should not be, their responsibility to spot it, but I think the responsibility is that to use the tools that are available to identify it, to then be able to say, right, now what becomes the next step?
Well, that's the next nice segue into the next question, is because obviously if they're not experts and they are not well, there's no desire for them to become experts for all the reasons you've rehearsed. So what is available to support them in this endeavor? Because it's a critically important process they need to go through. And how do you standardize that? Yeah.
So we know that there is some training out there at the moment, but this tends to be fairly superficial, and it's more about being able to spot those flags to then be able to kind of signpost onto the appropriate resources. Yeah. And I think it's important as well to remind ourselves that the PFS have said that this is not about a tick box thing. This goes beyond that. And so at Comentis, what we've created is an assessment tool that provides a proactive real-time assessment that identifies financial vulnerability, that identifies whether it's a one-off, whether it's a recurrent, whether it's fluctuating, whether it's individual, whether it's environmental cause, whether it's institutional factor. And in doing so, we then are able to say, now, according to your company's policies, these are the next steps. And so what that does is it provides a consistent and auditable tool that takes the burden away from the advisor and provides solutions rather than kind of raising more problems and questions, because we know that, you know, financial vulnerability isn't a stop-go thing. And so it's about kind of going beyond that. And I mean, the solution we've got, and of course, this is one of the reasons why we're working with Time for Advice, is because, you know, it's enabled to be integrated into existing, you know, advice processes to make it as easy and as seamless for the advisor as possible. So
that sounds great in theory, but how does Comentis actually do it? How does it enable you to identify the financial vulnerability of your client, or potential financial vulnerability?
So what we've done,
and is it reliable? Is it reliable? I mean, you know, do you get the right outcomes?
So what we've done in conjunction with members of the European Board of Assessment, the European Board of Psychology, and the UK Board of Psychology, we developed a series of, if you like, psychometric testing questions that are aligned to the FCA definition and requirements, and it's seamlessly integrated into the existing pathways.
Yeah. And that's it. So it's basically a process that is adopted. But you know, if I was a consumer, okay, so I'm a potential client, and my advisor starts walking me through what sound like could be quite sort of personal questions to sort of surface my vulnerability, is that not quite intrusive? Would I not feel slightly exposed as a result of that sort of line of questioning?
So we've deliberately designed it to have a minimal impact on the client's pathway.
Right.
You know, it will utilize data that you guys are already collecting, Curo.
Yeah.
And by combining that with our unique dynamic kind of question set, the intrusion is minimal. And the reality is that the client is actually unlikely to even know they've been assessed.
Okay.
And I also think it's important that this is about, it's not about saying to the client, you are vulnerable, therefore you can't do this, or you can only do that. It's about flagging up to the advisor the vulnerability, and then saying to the advisor, now this is how you support and help manage the client with that.
Okay, so it's formalizing an appropriate response to the client that you're dealing with, and how should that protect me? You know, as an advisor, again, coming back to the purely selfish concern, how does that look after me, and why should I care? And I know that sounds awful. I do apologize. I'm not meaning to be so obnoxious, but I think it's important to just understand, you know, from an advisor's perspective, the benefit of going through this process, because it just seems like another, you know, reason not to do business. So, you know, why will this help me in future? So
what this will provide is a robust defense against any future claims. It's a transparent, auditable tool. It sits, you know, and it's been developed in line with national and international assessment kind of protocols and processes. It meets all of the FCA requirements and international assessment guidelines. I mean, there are no guarantees in life,
for sure.
But, you know, what we know is that most FOS claims are upheld not because of bad advice, but because of bad recording.
Yeah.
And by using this tool, you know, it kind of eliminates, as best as we can do, that element of the potential claim.
And I think that sounds fascinating. I think, you know, anything the advice community can do to address these really serious considerations and concerns, I think is a great step forward. And also with the regulatory pressures that you're talking about, actually firms have no choice, do they? They've got to do it, and they've got to demonstrate that they've gone through some form of process. And what you're telling me, or what I'm hearing, is you've created an out-of-the-box solution that's non-intrusive, that's easy to manage, that gives you the protections you need as an advisor to ensure that you've covered off these essential concerns and have an audit trail of sorts to protect yourself in future. Would that about sum it up?
That's absolutely spot on.
Fabulous, Tim. And just to sort of finish off, I mean, how long have you been doing this, and have you taken it to firms in market, and what sort of reaction are you getting?
So we've taken it to a number of firms in the market. The reaction is very, very positive. Every single compliance team that we've shown it to have said this absolutely meets what we need to do. You know, we're quite excited because there's nothing else out there like this in the market. There is nothing else as proactive as this. Yeah. From my experience, I've been assessing financial vulnerability and mental capacity for, well, as I said, I've got over 25 years experience, specifically these two things in kind of the clinical, non-clinical, legal and financial sectors for over 10 years. So it's been really well received. Like I said, we've got a number of, you know, firms that are very, very excited about it. And, you know, we're looking to launch it within the next, you know, have it out and launch within the next month. So exciting.
So that was my question. So what is the plan to bring it to market, and what is the time scale? So you've said next month is when people are going to start hearing more about Comentis and the service you're providing, yeah? Okay. Brilliant. Well, look, that was fantastic. And thank you very much indeed, Tim, for spending the time with us today. I think that's really interesting. And certainly from our perspective, picking up that conversation about how we can integrate your process through the KYC onboarding process manifest in Cura, I think is a really worthy conversation and something that we'll push ahead with. But thank you. I found that fascinating. And as I said, really interesting and important, obviously. Brilliant. So appreciate your time today. Thanks, Tim. Nice to meet you.
Likewise. Bye.